All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I am delighted to host a conversation today with Maarten Verwey, who is the Deputy Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission. He's been in that post since February 2020. Our conversation today will be about the economy of the European Union and about the European Union's economic policy response to the COVID-19 crisis. We'll also touch upon the European Union, European Commission's broader economic policy agenda as we hopefully recover from the crisis. It's involving fiscal institutions and its management of the European macroeconomy. It should be an interesting conversation, obviously of particularly importance given the worldwide economic crisis we have suddenly found ourselves in. Let me introduce my guest today. So as I said, Maarten Verwey is Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs in the European Commission. Prior to his current job, he was Director General for Structural Reform Support, a topic we'll touch upon a little bit as well, I imagine. And prior to that, he was Deputy Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs. He also worked extensively on the so-called Juncker Plan, which we'll talk about as well. Anyway, with that introduction out of the way, Maarten, I wanted to start out by just talking about the way in which the crisis has unfolded over the past few months in Europe, and especially what actions have been taken to deal with the crisis, both, if you want, on the public health side and especially on the economic policy side of things to deal with the crisis, or since the beginning of the year, January, February, up till now, and then afterwards we can talk to we can turn to the policy response and the outlook for the European economy. So please go ahead if you want, set the stage for us.
Yeah. Okay, Stan. Well, thank you very much for having me with you. Good. I suppose it's good. Good afternoon. No, what is it in your case?
Good morning here, 9 a.m. in Washington,
yes.
D.C. That's right. 3 p.m. in Brussels,
sorry.
Which is where Maarten is calling in from. That's right.
No, sorry about that. No, let me indeed start by saying a few words on the economy and the response to the EU response to it. Like I would say, almost every other part of the globe, the EU has been hit hard by the crisis. I think we were a bit ahead in many ways of the US. So in our case, the crisis started in earnest towards the end of February, with very severe lockdowns from early March onwards. Now clearly that has had a major impact on the economy of the EU and on the economic outlook. We've seen a major drop, like elsewhere, in production, in services, in particular in the end of the first quarter and in the second quarter. Now in May. Early May, we came out with our spring forecast for this year, where we projected a decline of the EU economy of around 7.5%, which is far more severe than we have seen actually in the global financial crisis, and to be followed by a relatively strong rebound in next year. But even so, we would anticipate an incomplete recovery. Now, already at the time of our spring forecast, we noted a number of key downward risks, and we said, look, the risks are really tilted towards the downside, and as a matter of fact, some of these risks we have seen materializing since then. So for starters, the external environment turned out worse than we had expected in spring, and you can see that also notably we've seen that emerging economies are stronger hit by the pandemic than we at least had anticipated at that point in time. But also very importantly, the lockdown period lasted in the end longer than we had anticipated. So in our baseline scenario, we expected a 6% or a lockdown period of around 6 weeks, which in reality was closer to 8 weeks. Now, on the positive side, and that brings me to the policy response, we have seen an EU policy response which is stronger than we actually had anticipated at the time of the spring forecast. And let me say a few words on that. Certainly compared to the global financial crisis, I think one can say that the policy response in the EU at all levels has been much faster and much bolder than we have seen before. That started with actions by the ECB, but to be followed very, very quickly by also bold actions at the level of the member states. So by now, we have seen discretionary fiscal measures to the tune of above 4% of GDP at the level of the member states. And member states have also taken massive liquidity measures to the tune of more than 20% of GDP. And these measures were actually very rapidly complemented also by a number of quick reactions at the EU level. So in a few weeks' time, we flexibilized completely the existing EU budget, which freed up I think around 60 billion in underutilized resources, which could be used instantly for the crisis. We reached relatively quickly an agreement on a different use of our ESM, the European Stability Mechanism facility, and also on a pan-European guarantee fund managed by the EIB. And this was done all quickly. And then I should mention one instrument that we have proposed ourselves. It's a facility to support member states in the financing of their short-term work scheme. So it was an instrument to the tune of 100 billion too. So this we did all relatively quickly. And then, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. That was actually before the Commission put on the table its proposals for a recovery plan for Europe. So all in all, yeah.
Maarten, before we go down that route, I wanted to go back to something you said about fiscal policy measures taken by the member states, right? Which have been significant. Not quite as large as a share of GDP as here in the US, but sort of same order of magnitude, basically. So there, normally, of course, member states of the European Union are constrained in what they are allowed to do on the fiscal policy side of things under the Stability and Growth Pact / Fiscal Compact rules. Can you talk a little bit about how those rules have been adjusted for the current crisis? Because I think, you know, here in the US, a lot of states, for example, have balanced budget requirements, and they don't have much leeway to respond to a crisis at all. Those are often constitutionally mandated within the states. And so the states don't have this kind of leeway at all. I think within the European Union context, they normally don't either. But I think in this extraordinary moment, a lot of the usual rules have been waived, right? So as I mentioned, on the fiscal policy front, but also in terms of the legality of state aid, in terms of restrictions on free movement that normally would not fly. Can you talk a little bit about that side of
Sure.
the policy response, which basically it's a deregulation in some sense?
Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing it up, and happy to do so. Let me also first before I go there make one point that compared to the US, the automatic stabilizers in the EU are actually bigger. So I think if you would probably add up the two, I doubt that the difference would be actually so big. That as an aside. But you're absolutely right. Under normal circumstances, member state would not be allowed first to support on this scale their enterprises because they would fall under our state aid regime. But given the severity of the situation and the emergency, we have very quickly also flexibilized on a temporary basis our state aid rules. So we've increased the possibilities for member states to provide support to corporates, and this actually has been very important because it allowed, for example, to provide support in the form of these short-term work schemes, which in a way act as solvency support to corporates, and that has had a very mitigating impact on unemployment numbers. So that's one. It also allowed for for these liquidity facilities that I've just mentioned, which helped corporates to survive over this period. Similarly, we have indeed under normal, so we have rules in place for that constrain member states in their fiscal policy. Not as strict as the balance as you have it on the state level, obviously, but nevertheless there is a constraint. And we have triggered something that is called a general escape clause, which is actually meant for situations like this, that if we are in a generalized economic and severe downturn, then the Council, on the proposal of the Commission, can decide to at least suspend some of a part of these rules, which in practice means that member states have a greater degree of freedom in terms of responding to that situation.
So that's sort of where we have been over the past few months. You mentioned briefly your spring outlook for GDP. Obviously, -7.5% is pretty bad. I mean, it's obviously what we're seeing around the world. And then I think the 2021 rebound, there'll probably be some of that, but obviously that's more uncertain even than this year's development. I wanted to ask you if you can give us a broader sense of the macroeconomic situation as it is now, sort of union-wide. One big difference, and you alluded to it briefly with the US, is that unemployment is just significantly lower than it is in the US because of various labor market institutions that many European countries have that the US just doesn't really have. I think it really is a key difference, I think, between the two economies. And then I was also wondering if you could maybe go into a little more detail. And obviously, it's still early to know where things are going to go. If you can talk a little bit about the situation in Spain and Italy, which were really hit hardest at first, and then perhaps also about the situation in Sweden, which received a lot of attention here in the US because of its sort of looser approach to lockdowns and to the public health situation. And again, maybe it's too early to really issue a clear verdict on how that worked out. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the situation in the labor market, and then about those 3 countries to the extent that you think you can.
Okay. A few points on this. You're right that the impact so far on the labor market has been rather benign, certainly compared to the US, but more generally, and certainly also if you consider the drop of GDP or production. Now there are a number of explanations for that. One I alluded to already: the short-term work schemes, which existed already in quite a few member states, but in the crisis, new ones have been created. So this is now becoming a dominant model in the EU. There are, however, also a number of statistical issues and regulatory issues that play into this. In order to be unemployed, you need to be available for the labor market, which is a problem in a lockdown situation. So there is a bit of a distortion, probably coming from there, and a number of countries, I think, have introduced sort of a moratoria on forced job losses. So if you look at the number of the reduction in the hours worked, actually, clearly you see a much bigger impact than if you look at simply.
I see. So for our viewers, a pretty big chunk of the people who are counted as unemployed here in the US are people who are on temporary layoff, and so they would, in many cases, not be counted as unemployed.
So that there is, you need to take that into account. Now, clearly, a policy choice has been made here, which I think, and a different policy choice is probably being made in the US, is to maintain the connection between, as much as possible, between the people and their company or institution where they work. Now, having said all this, we would expect unemployment to go up further as we go along, and so we would anticipate a bit of a delayed effect, but not to the extent that we have seen unemployment, I think, in the US. Now, also on the short-term outlook, briefly, we're coming out tomorrow actually with a new forecast, an interim forecast. Now, I cannot tell you what that will be, but I was explaining these different downward risks that partially have materialized, and I think you can deduct from that the picture doesn't look better. So we will not surprise on the upside with this forecast. And as a matter of fact, most institutions that have come after our spring forecast have come out with worse figures than we. Now, turning to Spain and Italy, both Spain and Italy, they have been particularly hard hit by the crisis, by the pandemic. This is partially maybe bad luck, but there's also, to a large extent, has something to do also with the structure of the economy. With a very large part of it dependent on tourism, and clearly tourism, leisure, which are clearly sectors that are particularly hard hit by the pandemic. in our spring forecast, we anticipated a drop in GDP of bigger than 9% for both countries. And again, I'm afraid that we will not surprise on the upside there too. Clearly with very big impact on our resulting in a big impact also on the government finances, which we see across the board in the EU, but given the size of the drop of GDP in Spain and Italy, it's more pronounced there than elsewhere. That said, and this is a bit true for all countries, also for them. It is most of the measures that they have taken, they are one-off, and we would expect with a return to growth that also we would expect their fiscal positions to improve also very quickly. But what you're left with is an increase of the stock of debt, clearly, which is considering the debt levels, notably for Italy a bit more than for Spain. This is clearly not good news.
So on that point, how does the union transition back into its fiscal rules? How does that work? Because obviously there's a shock to the stock of debt, and so is there a timeline for when the fiscal constraints start applying again with their full force, or is that unclear and just subject to the political process?
No timeline has been fixed for that, also for a very good reason, because still at this point in time, and you will recognize that from the situation in the US, there's an extremely high level of uncertainty, and that is completely linked to the trajectory of the virus. So we seem to be on our way out, which is so things look definitely much better today already in Europe than they did, let's say 6 weeks ago. But sadly, the virus is still around, so one cannot rule out the re-emergence of the virus, which can lead to a reimposition of lockdown measures or a partially reimposition. So as long as this given the fact that this uncertainty about the recovery is so big, it would also be very difficult for us to make recommendations on what would be the right fiscal trajectory in the current circumstances. So the Commission has decided to wait a bit longer to see what the developments will look like. At the same time, what is also very, very clear, that given the shock to the system, and given the fact that also next year and for certainly for Spain and Italy also the years thereafter, we will still be below the 2019 levels. That suggests that it may not be the best time to impose austerity. So we from, at least from the Commission side, we would see a continued need for fiscal support in the time to come, but in a prudent way, and taking into account clearly the outlook at that point in time. And last point that I want to emphasize again is, given the fact that most of these measures are actually of a temporary nature, we will have in a way, a sort of an automatic reversal of fiscal policy simply by not, if member states do not extend these temporary measures. Over to you.
Sorry, I had a brief interruption here in my internet connection. As we joked during our pre-conversation, it's perhaps time for a stimulus package for rural broadband here in the District of Columbia.
Right.
I don't know. It's worse every day. Before we go to the sort of current political discussion about the recovery fund, I wanted to see, did you talk about Sweden? Because
sorry, I didn't talk.
I just missed I missed a few seconds.
Yeah,
okay,
no,
so
no.
let's go to Sweden, and then we go to the recovery fund. Yeah.
Well, what can I say about Sweden? Sweden chose a slightly different approach than some of the other member states. Even though I think one should also say it's not black and white. I think I would say the geographical circumstances in Sweden you cannot compare to the geographical circumstances in let's say a city like Paris. I mean, you need to take these differences into account, and in reality there have been differences in approach between all member states, also depending on the actually the severity of the pandemic, but the overall impression is that Sweden has followed a slightly more loose approach than some of the other member states. Now, I think it would not be for me, I think, to pass judgment on that. I think so that I won't do. I mean, one can see, I think, but I need to be a bit careful because I have not looked very specifically at the numbers, but the number of casualties seems to be somewhat higher in Sweden than maybe in the neighboring countries, which has attracted discussions. And I think it's too soon to tell to see how that will play out in the end. Some of the neighboring countries, they have been able to relax quicker. They were more severe in first instance. They were able to relax a bit quicker. For Sweden, it's a bit longer. Now that has helped them, I think, a bit in the cushioning the initial economic impact, which has been relatively mild, I think, in Sweden compared to some other countries. At the same time, one can only pass judgment on that, or well, at the end of the day, if all costs are being counted, and
Sure.
I think it's simply too early for that.
So one last. So you mentioned external risk earlier in your assessment of the economic outlook for the EU, and obviously the US is now on a very different trajectory in terms of the spread of the disease. Is that something that feeds into your concern there as well, that the US will just not recover as fast as I think people were hoping 3 months ago?
Yeah, no, but that clearly, if that were to be the case, the US being a big market, that would have an impact. So I was mentioning the overall our assumptions around the external side, and clearly the US is part of that. Even so, we already at the time of the spring forecast, we could see that the US was trailing behind. So I think we have captured quite a bit of that already in our spring forecast. But clearly, if the US would follow a completely different trajectory, than Europe and China has done so far, then that would be bad news for the world economy and certainly also for Europe.
All right, so now let's go from sort of the current situation really to the future. The first thing I want to talk about, obviously, is the proposed recovery fund, that would be financed in some way or another through the issuance of debt that the union as a whole is responsible for. It's been presented really as a watershed moment in some of the press coverage here in the US, but it's of course also encountered a lot of opposition within the European Union, especially from the so-called Frugal Four, of which our shared homeland of the Netherlands is one. Can you talk about what the current proposal really is? Give us a sense of the size and where you think that process is going, and with the understanding that obviously political negotiations are ongoing.
Yeah, no, what the Commission has proposed and has asked for is essentially an authorization to borrow up to 750 billion euro, and to use that for essentially two things: to channel 500 billion of that to EU expenditure programs, and to channel another 250 billion of that into a loan facility for member states. Now, that is in many respects a novel proposal. Now, just to make one thing clear, it's not the case that it's new for the EU to borrow. We're doing that on a regular basis. But what is new is that we borrow to spend, and that is something that has not been done before. Normally, if we borrow, then we on-lend it back to back to member states for a certain purpose. Now, so I think this is the key novelty. So not so much the issuance itself, but the channeling of these resources through expenditure programs. Now, the bulk of this money.
And so, sorry to interrupt, but so you're saying it's not that novel because there are mechanisms like the ESM in place, and they.
But even borrowing against the EU budget, we have done before. So, but what is new is the size. I mean,
that really is important, I think, to give people a sense. So $750 billion is about 5 times the annual budget of the EU, something like that.
Yes, it's so it's So it is massive in terms of size, and so it's about 5% of GDP, which is a lot actually, and so it's the size, and it's the fact that we incur debt at the union level to pay for expenditure. And now, to be precise, what do we want to do with this money? Is mostly to use this to fund investments, and the central. It's not the only program, but the central program in this is the so-called Recovery and Resilience Facility, which would provide 310 billion in investment grants and 250 billion in investment loans to member states to finance programs of reforms and investments. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to look for combinations of reforms and investments that, well, first of all, help us to speed up the recovery. That's very important, but also to transform the structure of the economy, to make the economy greener, smarter, as we say, so more digitalized and also resilient. Now, why did this package put forward? And I think one very important reason for this is that we saw that, and in a way you touched on it by pointing to Italy and Spain, that even though this crisis is almost by definition of a symmetric nature, the implications are not symmetric at all. So some countries are hit harder than other countries, and the sad reality is actually that a number of the countries that have been hit the hardest are also the countries that probably have are the least resilient to these shocks. So we really believe that we need something at the central level, that it needs to be big to make sure that these divergences that were already there before the crisis, that they will not widen, that they will be reduced, and that's the last point that I would say, but that is also very important for the functioning of our internal market, because then that's maybe also to our shared home country. I mean, a country that likes to export a lot, but clearly, if a part of the single market, if there's no demand, there's nothing to export. So we very much believe that we have a common interest to emerge together from this crisis.
So there's obviously a number of concerns that people have expressed about this kind of development, and I guess the first one would be that it'll be difficult to restrict this effort just to the crisis response, right? That as you mentioned, there's divergence in growth across member states that predates the crisis, and there's no reason why that would necessarily disappear after the crisis. And so if you start trying to massage that away with large money flows from the union, you're going to end up in a situation where those flows will become permanent, and they'll just be an additional layer on top of structural reforms or structural funds or whatever people don't like about the sort of distributional functions of the union. What would you, and I don't know, maybe the Commission's view is that there should be more of a permanent flow of investment funds for Italy and Spain and other countries. But to the extent that countries are concerned, that member states are concerned about that, what do you tell them? And obviously, how people stand.
Well, I know perfectly well these concerns, and I've spent actually the best part of my career in the Dutch Ministry of Finance. Exactly. So probably I know better than almost anybody these concerns. Now, what would I tell? Well, first of all, that the proposal that we have made for the borrowing side is, and it's a bit technical, but it's a proposal to change the so-called own resources decision. And that, so the authorization to borrow comes from there. But the way this proposal is formulated and drafted, it's crystal clear that the authorization that we ask for is of a temporary nature, and that will be assured by the ratification process, because this own resources decision will have to be ratified by all parliaments in Europe. So there isn't, even if people in the Commission were to think, well, we want to extend this beyond this instant, it's simply not possible, because parliaments would and the first ones to block it is actually in the countries that you mentioned. They would not go along with an extension for no purpose. So there is a very strong legal lock on the door that can in no way be broken by the Commission against the will of all member states. So it requires unanimity. So it doesn't get any stronger than that. No, but the reason again that we have come forward, and I think also the reason why Germany this time around is supporting it is in a recognition and a realization that this is really a unique situation, and we have learned from previous crises that if you try, I mean, the problems don't go away by themselves. And the approach during the global financial crisis and during the euro crisis in Europe has often been characterized by too little, too late. Now, I think it's bad luck that we're again in the crisis, but I think the good luck is that there are still sufficient people around that actually remember and very vividly the previous crisis. And
I think certainly here in the US, the fiscal and monetary policy response, I think, have been really qualitatively different precisely because of that, right? Just because people recognize what went wrong, what in the end worked out fine after the financial crisis.
Exactly, and I think I can see this also here. I mean, I was around at the time of the global financial crisis, and I see the difference now. And there's a determination now to act quickly. On top of that, also the entire external environment is much more negative than before. So the idea that we can export our way out of this, it ain't gonna happen. And I think this is also well understood by Germany, and I think that changes the whole balance in this discussion.
So two other things you hear, and I think Maarten Verwey said this very openly last week, is that these significant amount of money, what's it going to be spent on? And I think he said we don't want this this money to be used to implement Podemos's party platform, which obviously the Spanish government should do what it wants with its money to some extent, but I think it is a sentiment that exists, right? So what are we going to do with all this money? To what extent is it going to be directed to national priorities versus common priorities set by the member states as a group? And then the second, I think, sentiment that you hear expressed is that this kind of support should come with a certain level of conditionality, precisely because the goal should be to limit divergence after this crisis goes away, and to make sure that different parts of the union can grow at similar rates. What do you say to those two things? Yeah.
Now, I think I think actually, if you look at the proposal now, and I may be a bit biased, but I recognize that I think it's actually a very balanced proposal. So, but let me just explain, and I think again, this recovery and resilience facility, I think, since this is by far the biggest part of the package, I think it gives a good indication as to the thinking of this.
It's almost half, right?
It's more than half. So it's five.
Oh, half of the direct spending. Yeah. Sure.
Or even more than half.
More than half of direct spending. A little less than half of the.
So it's with the loan facility and the grants, it's 560 out of the 750.
Oh, I see. I see. You're counting the 250 there.
So it's really the biggest part.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Now, the way this is going to work is that member states, they will need to draw up their own recovery and resilience plans. So that is, let's say, the country. So the start of all of this lies with the country, and this is important because we have also learned that for reforms to stick, you need to have. It's important to have country ownership. Now, that said, these plans, they need to be consistent with certain union priorities, and that's where your point come in. So they need to be consistent with the country-specific recommendations that the Council, so the ministers, all the ministers together, give on an annual basis to the member states on what type of reforms, what type of investments are important to undertake for a specific country. So that this is exactly to make sure that the reforms and investments that are done, that they also correspond to the common view or the shared view of what is important to do for the union to function better. So that's the first part. And the second part is that in a very explicit way, these programs, they need to contribute to greening, on the one hand, the greening of the economy, and on the other hand, also on a digitalization of these economies, so a modernization of these economies. So these are, so you will horizontal requirements that will be put on these programs, and only only programs that meet these various criteria, which will be assessed by us, they will be eligible for finance. Now, then, how do member states in the end get the finance that they have asked for? Is we define together with member states targets and milestones, both in relation to reforms and in relation to the investment. And only if these milestones are being achieved, then that unlocks a payment from under the Recovery and Resilience Facility. So I think my answer actually to those would be, well, if you look at the biggest expenditure program that is in there, there is this, you find actually this balance. It will have the reform, it will have the investments, and it will not just be given for nothing. No, it will be provided if and only if member states actually do what they say that they are going to do.
So we have about we have a little over 10 minutes left. There's a few topics I want to touch on that are a little less directly related to the COVID-19 crisis, and though the first one, I guess, is somewhat related to these investment priorities. Here in the US, we now have gone through years and years of discussion about a potential infrastructure package to be passed by the federal government that could include things from highways to rural broadband, hopefully some broadband here for the District of Columbia, refurbishing school buildings, a wide range of things. And I was wondering if you could just briefly talk about your experience with the Juncker plan and how that's gone, how that's informed maybe some of the investment priorities that are now being realized.
Yep. Okay. Now, maybe for those that are not aware with what the Juncker plan is, and I can imagine that there are many, it may not be.
No, for sure.
that basically this was a plan drawn up and designed by the previous president of the Commission, and this was a response to the crisis. Now, the plan was composed of a number of pillars. One pillar was targeted on basically eliminating bottlenecks to investments. The other, so they can be in the regulatory planning environment. Another part was about building the pipeline of investable projects, and then the third pillar, even though I think we presented it as the first pillar, so I do it in the wrong order, was a financing facility, which in a way is what one could call a blending facility. So we from the community budget, we provided a budgetary guarantee to the EIB, so the European Investment Fund, which allowed them to provide more risky finance to the type of projects that you mentioned. So by now, I mean we have more or less come, or we're coming to the end of the investment period of the Juncker plan. Well, I don't know. I do not have the exact number of projects, but what I can say is that I think we reached actually last week, if I remember correctly, the milestone of that around 500 billion in investment had been at least co-financed by this facility. So it has had a pretty good impact, and I think it certainly has helped to finance the kind of projects that you mentioned. Now, we're going to have a successor program of this. It's called Invest EU, of an even bigger size. We think this is important, but we're trying to target it a bit more to specific policy areas. So whereas in 2013, when we started with the Juncker plan, or 2014, the main goal was investment. Didn't really matter which investment. The way we have set up the Invest EU program now is more related to specific target areas, also to avoid that we're crowding out too much private finance. Now, and here the areas that immediately come to mind, and which will be very important, is again the green. Or as you were joking, rural broadband. It is so in the cities there's not much that you have to do. That will normally the market will take care of that. In rural areas it may be more difficult. So you may need different types of finance. And I think what we have been experimenting with here is more and more these blending of different facilities. We can have partially publicly financed, partially by risk financing through the EIB, and partly pure private sector. So that's so that's a bit the approach that we're taking.
So then again, this is really a mixed lot of topics. But so the Commission a few years ago proposed a digital services tax that hasn't been implemented at the union level yet, but a lot of individual member states have either implemented or are in the process of implementing such a tax. Obviously, the United States, I think for good reason, has been very unhappy with some of these proposals. Can you talk to us just briefly on where these taxes stand on the sort of EU-wide level, and what the Commission what the Commission foresees there?
Okay. Now look, there were also discussions ongoing in the OECD, as you know, on the topic. Let me be very clear from on 2 points. First of all, we prefer by far a global approach, and we thought we were working towards that in the context of the OECD. Now, recently, the US pulled out of that discussion, but clearly we hope that the US will come back to that. Now, at the same time, we have indicated that if it's not possible to come forward on the to agree on a global approach, then the Commission will come forward with own initiatives in this type, because we even though we support the member states that have introduced these taxes, we do not consider it optimal from the union perspective that all come with their own different taxes. So it is an area where we would like to move as well.
Excellent. And then I'm going to close out with one last question. Of course, the United Kingdom has left the European Union. Negotiations are ongoing about the future relationship, but perhaps more importantly, more important for you, negotiations are also ongoing for the first EU budget without the UK as a part of the union. How is that hole of contributions being filled? Is there a shift in priorities now that the UK is gone? Are these negotiations in a sense being delayed until the crisis is over? How should we think about that?
No, quite the contrary. But okay, no. Now, clearly, with the UK leaving, that leaves a hole in the budget that needs to be dealt with. No, but I have to say that the whole UK issue has been overtaken in a way by the corona crisis. So what is now in the making is a process. So the crisis response and the negotiation of the multi-annual budget, they have collapsed in one. So it's not that they have collapsed, to be clear, but they are
they're folded into one.
They are folded into one. And as a matter of fact, so the recovery plan that I was talking about, or the as we call it here, next generation EU, that is one part. And the other part of the negotiations is are the negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework, and they will be concluded together. So we have now a summit planned for the 17th, 18th of July, where both topics are on the table, and where the President of the European Council will try to forge a compromise on both elements at the same time. And yeah, in that sense, I wouldn't say that the UK is is never. I mean, it's close to us, but it's a bit less in the forefront of our thoughts than it was some time ago, I think.
I think that's probably true for all of us. And with that, Maarten, thank you very much for doing this. Thanks to our audience for attending. Thank you for questions you sent. I'm sorry I didn't get to each one of them. But thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.